Chapter 5: A New Problem. My head hurts. Oh dear God. His head hurt, like it had been cracked open and sewn back up 100 times by the snake Sanin for fun. And his legs hurt too. These insightful musings were some of the first thoughts at the surface of Gaara's otherwise blank mind when he regained consciousness on the cold, hard forest floor. The demon jailer took a few moments to clear his head of the useless self-assessing thoughts he'd been fixating on in his stupor so that he could take stock of where he was and how he had gotten there. It didn't take long for Gaara to recall his evening jog, run in the woods followed by the disturbing sensation he'd experienced shortly before passing out rather unexpectedly. Gaara looked around the densely vegetated area he was now standing in. But what he saw didn't quite match up with the memory he had of the area from when he had arrived there only an hour ago, or so he guessed judging by the darkness of the sky and the position of the bright full moon. The area wasn't completely different. In fact, it looked perfectly familiar, just wrong. The still groggy teenager spent a few more moments processing what he was seeing and then it all clicked, like the cocking of a pump-action shotgun. And the realization that followed was just as pleasant as what one might expect to follow after hearing the distinctive cocking of the said gun. The surroundings he found himself in were indeed exactly the same in appearance, just as they were when he had fallen asleep earlier that evening, but now that he looked closely, really closely, he saw that they were at least twice as big as they had been. As astute as Gaara was during the majority of his exploits, it took even longer for him to realize that it wasn't that the woods had grown through some genjutsu or through use of the Mokuton bloodline, both of which existed only in his world and the latter being extinct as far as he knew. No, the fact was that the trees and bushes around him hadn't grown bigger but rather he'd shrunk to about half his original size. Oh, great. Gaara had never been a tall child and even into his teenage years he'd retained his diminutive stature, which his sister had often argued was as a result of his lack of sleep when Kankuro would tease the Jinchuriki about his size. Of course, his older brother wasn't stupid or suicidal enough to actually make any disparaging remarks about Gaara to his face as the redhead still had anger control issues from time to time. However, now that Gaara was effectively half his old height, it gave him a whole new appreciation for his previously relatively short body when opposed to this new miniature one. Now, there was just one immediately pressing mystery left for him to solve. What's that, moving behind my head? Turning around, Gaara didn't see anything other than the obnoxiously tall bushes that he'd expected to find, but then, there it was again. The unknown fur-covered creature brushing against the back of his head softly, flattening the hair on the nape of his neck. Whipping around, again and again, produced nothing more than a dizzy mini Gaara and no sign of whatever foolish animal was playing tricks on him. Deciding to cut this vexatious game short, lest he trips on the circus tent he was wearing, Gaara dug his hand into his now oversized clothes, which were so baggy on him he had trouble rooting through the folds before he produced a handful of sand without so much as looking down at it. He flexed his usual control over the sand and he waited for it to rise into his view so he could restrain, read, attack, the nuisance that was bothering him during what was already a difficult time, but the creature's discovery, unbeknownst to Gaara, was going to lead to even more tribulation on his part. It took Gaara no longer than a second to realize that the sand he had commanded had failed to rise as instructed or even stir, except for the small amounts trickling between his fingers and falling to the forest floor. When Gaara looked down to diagnose the origin of the problem, he was hit by two revelations, the first of which was an unwelcome discovery that filled him with dread, and the second was one of self-disparagement at not having noticed the first one sooner. As the shinobi looked down at his hands, he realized, with dire consternation, what was brushing the back of his neck, the very same thing that gave a responsive twitch as he concentrated on its movements. It became all too clear as he stared down at the fuzzy paws, complete with digital pads, where his hands should have been. He turned them over to look at the other side of the sandy-colored fur that covered the appendages that apparently belonged to him. Out of desperation more than logic, He brought his paws up to his fluffy chest and tried to dispel the horrible genjutsu someone had used on him, only to find that he wasn't in a genjutsu nor was he still asleep, as the highly acclaimed ninja test of pinching oneself proved. A task made all the more difficult because of the small size and almost rounded shape of the digits he was using. The equally fluffy, if not more so, a tail that had been brushing against the back of his head, came into view when he honed in on the tail's sensations. It was as he feared, he'd turned into a mini furry shukaku. The enormous raccoon tail that was similarly sand-colored and featured the characteristic blue swirls all over it just about proved that it was the same as the accursed demon inside of him. Funnily enough, he couldn't hear the demons ranting and raving at the moment, but he had bigger problems than the unusual silence of his normally rambunctious tenant, namely his size and loss of sand control, equating to defenselessness for the shinobi who had once bragged of having the ultimate defense. Ever the pragmatist, to the extent that he could adapt seamlessly to a new world in moments, Gaara didn't dwell on what he desperately hoped was a temporary change, as he now had to focus on how he, as a small and fluffy tanuki human with no chakra control or special powers, was going to survive the entire night in the infamously dangerous and aptly named Forbidden Forest. It appeared that he wasn't a full-fledged tanuki. Thankfully, when he considered certain tanuki body parts that would have made running a trifle more difficult. Also, he thanked whatever gods may be that he didn't have to cope without opposable thumbs during this troublesome ordeal, no matter how small the thumbs he had were. Apart from his height, stubby-fingered paws and tail that was easily a foot taller than him on its own, Gaara appeared to have a fairly humanoid body, with the added bonus of surprisingly warm sand-colored fur with the same blue markings as those on his tail, though sparser it seemed as he looked over his new body. And people said Gaara was a pessimist, at least he was warm. Gaara replaced the sand in his pocket, ready for the morning when he would transform back if he had any good luck going for him at all. After his lifeline was secure, he shed all his oversized clothes completely, as they would do nothing but hinder his movement and identify him as the vulnerable Hogwarts student he currently was. Besides, he was covered in fur to keep him warm, so he didn't see the harm in leaving his folded clothes in the hollowed-out base of a nearby tree for the time being, with a few scratches around said tree as well as surrounding trees to guide him back to his garments when the sun was to rise. Courtesy of his newly discovered and auspiciously sharp claws, Gaara didn't have to worry about his clothes being lost when the time came. One feature that Gaara found to be even more irksome than his further diminished prosperity were his newly discovered digitigrade legs that made him feel like he was walking on his tiptoes constantly. He had trouble taking more than a few steps without teetering and falling when his concentration and balance wavered in the slightest. Like the canid he had transformed into, Gaara's new back legs now had shorter thighs and calves and longer feet, meaning he now had to perform a sort of shuffle to walk forwards rather than actually stepping. As Gaara had dropped off his clothes, he resolved to find out how to walk around properly with his incommodiously short digitigrade legs. The final alteration that he noticed was that he could make some unintelligible sounds out of his previously heavily damaged throat. It seemed that this form completely regenerated his vocal cords. Unfortunately, it also appeared that he could not speak any coherent human words without sounding like a dog performing a trick, as this voice box wasn't built to speak, merely growl, whine and create any number of other animalistic sounds. Still, it was nice to be able to make himself heard again, even if it was nonsense and incoherent guttural noises and the occasional angry snarl of frustration when he fell over again and again. Walking wasn't at all difficult once he'd gotten used to ambling around on his new legs. Running, on the other hand, was arduous if not impossible whilst carrying the considerable weight of his tail with him. The weight didn't make any sense to Gaara, as, when he had squeezed the soft extremity, he'd discovered that it was almost all fur, only a thin flesh and bone tail in the center of the appendage that, including fuzz, was wider than his torso, at the tip. No matter how soft the thing felt when Gaara squeezed it to his chest with both arms, when it swayed to and fro behind him and hit a bush or tree sapling. The thing it hit was blown back as if it had been impacted with a large stone club. It was some measure of a consolation that he at least had a weapon of sorts with him, even if it was a large fluffy bat attached to his backside. Still, he didn't like his chances in a fight with only his teeny tiny claws, however sharp they might be, so the club was a reassurance. Rubus Hagrid was a caring man who tried in earnest to keep all of the animals under his watch in the safest condition he could, at the cost of his own health at times. Tonight was the full moon, and that meant that the newest addition to the teaching staff of Hogwarts, other than him, was indisposed in the worst and most dangerous manner imaginable. With the threat of the ferocious wolf running around in the woods every month, Hagrid had been assured that the monster would keep well away from all of his precious creatures, like the very ones he was leading away at the moment, because the bloodthirsty werewolf had strayed near their herd and Hagrid didn't want to risk their safety. The experienced groundskeeper didn't mind the stigma attached to Thestrals, nor did he let it deter him from his duty to them. He was well away from where he had heard the wolf's cries and now felt that he could let the so-called death creatures wander freely for the remainder of the night without them running into any Luna-related animals. As he threw the pheasants he'd been using to lure the abnormally obstinate winged horses away with him, Hagrid saw a strange little thing out of the corner of his eye. It looked so short that, as it walked on its two hind legs, it probably wouldn't be tall enough to stare at his belt buckle directly, though its massive tail would probably reach the bottom of his beard easily if it was pointed straight upwards. Needless to say, Hagrid was already fascinated by it. The Thestrals didn't object to their new surroundings as they galloped off together, fighting over the offerings of dead birds and a few dead ferrets Hagrid had been planning to give to his hippogriffs on account of their good behavior in his classes, but he wouldn't have trouble catching more, so he didn't see the harm. In the meantime, however, he was going to be hunting for something bigger and infinitely more interesting than ferrets, and appeared to be even more terrified of him than them. It wasn't like he wanted to catch or kill the small, fluffy animal, whatever it was. He just wanted to have a look at the sandy-colored mammal. It was incredibly odd to see a new creature in the forest he'd been patrolling for decades, but even odder was that the thing was running on two legs and looked almost humanoid in its panicked movements away from him, though his comparisons to humans ended there as he watched the creature trip or fall over after every few strides. Hagrid jogged as gently as a half-giant could after the strange animal that had captured his interest. Every once in a while he would see whatever he was chasing before it would disappear behind a tree or some roots. Hagrid chased the poor thing for well over an hour, never getting closer than 30 feet or so. Eventually he thought he might catch the scared little critter as it ran into a clearing, which was a relief to the tired man, but as luck would have it, in that very clearing stood the entire herd of Thestrals he'd released earlier on. The strange light brown creature seemed to hesitate at the sight of the Thestrals, Hagrid noted, before it apparently cut its losses and ran straight into the midst of them. Hagrid feared the tiny and defenseless morsel would become an after-dinner snack for the emaciated carnivorous horse monsters. What the oafish man didn't expect was for the Thestrals to crowd around the thing and block it from his view. Hagrid tried to push through them more to get them to disperse in case they were indeed eating the defenseless animal in there, but every time he managed to shift one Thestral, another would take its place and the moved one would rejoin the herd further away. Hagrid was reluctant to leave, but the Thestrals were not docile when angered and he couldn't take on 20 of them when angry just to examine an idle curiosity. Plus, there was a good chance that whatever it was would be around the next night if it had survived this long in the huddle, so he would just have to let it be and hope it stayed alive. Gara's midnight run hadn't been nearly as relaxed as Hagrid's had been, the Tanuki boy having had to sprint at top speed when he saw his care of magical creatures professor chasing after him. Whilst his miniature form had the major drawback of shorter legs, meaning he was nowhere near his top speed in human form, Fairy Gara's stamina made up for this shortfall quite adequately, as, even after an hour, he still wasn't out of breath. Another problem Gara had in his fluffy form was that his tail threw off his balance, meaning every few meters he'd fall over or stumble. destroying any hope of quickly developing the ability to run. Despite these drawbacks were the hateable legs he was attempting to run with. The abnormal joints and smaller surface area on which to spread his weight was completely at odds with his experience and physical memory of walking and running, and so he spent almost as much time on the ground as he did running along it. It was downright embarrassing for a ninja of his caliber to be suffering these indignities. Gaara ducked and dived as quickly as his training in stealth and evasion had taught him to in order to avoid his teacher and the obviously awkward questions that would be incurred by his capture. He thought he'd run out of luck when he stumbled into a clearing in the middle of the woods filled with the skeletal horses that he had seen draw the carts that carried the students from the train station to the castle a few weeks prior. He stopped himself, falling over again from the inertia, trying to remember if he had heard the beasts before him be described along the lines of small tanuki-eating winged horses. Deciding the risk would actually be worth keeping this secret safe, lest it become common knowledge that he was weakened once a month, Gaara started again towards the Thestrals, planning to cut straight through them and keep running. To his astonishment, though, he was welcomed into the herd that parted to allow him access and closed off around him, giving him a protective barrier of, apparently, non-small tanuki-eating winged horses. They were even careful not to stand on him or his sensitive tail. He'd discovered just how sensitive his tail was when he'd tried running with the thing in his arms and had cut into it a little with his claws. He would rather fall over with the thing swaying around behind him than cut it again. The tanuki boy waited with bated breath, as Hagrid tried to force his way into the herd, and only let out the breath he would never admit to holding in when the colossal man gave up and walked away with a dejected slump in his broad shoulders. Gaara disliked disappointing the obviously fanatical man, but his secret was now something he had to protect at any cost if he was retained both his safety and, maybe more importantly, his dignity. He was Sabeka no Gaara. He didn't do small and fluffy. When the magical beasts were alone in the clearing, transformed and Gaara felt it was safe enough to leave his temporary bodyguards and continue onwards. He had all night to look around and he didn't like how the smaller, overly friendly, Thestrals were nuzzling against his fluffy tail. It was unsettling to say the least. Leaving the inordinately affectionate animals, Gaara stumbled out from the forest of horse-like legs and back into the real forest to explore, and figure out exactly what he'd been turned into. When he'd found a quiet place where he would be safe for a few moments, a cozy little alcove under a tree, Gaara sat down awkwardly and attempted to enter his mindscape to question the monster that was undoubtedly to blame for his confounded new form. The little fluffy serial killer was further irked when he couldn't enter his mind like usual. If he was to turn back to his human form in the morning, he would spend a lengthy spell in his mind talking to his detainee, but until then he would just try to stay alive. Gaara decided that self-preservation without sand was much simpler given the ability to run, so he put his full energies into developing that difficult yet vital skill. He spent a pain-filled hour trying in vain to run on his back legs like he had always as a human, but that inevitably ended with him falling flat on his face, or on his back when he'd tried to stretch his tail out fully backwards. No matter what he tried or how he positioned his lead weight of a tail, he just couldn't run. He could walk just fine, if a little wobbly because of the new legs ending in paws that were still very foreign to him. Frankly, Gaara had had an idea of how he could move more quickly some time ago, but despite the desperate circumstances he was presented with, he couldn't bring himself to try it. As Gaara, panting with his tongue hanging out like some stray dog, lay on the dewy midnight ground, he finally surrendered to his instincts and rolled over onto his front. Pushing against the ground with his hands, paws, Gaara moved his legs under him until he was on all fours. It was a strange feeling, now that his legs and arms were the same length, even more so as the position was infinitely more comfortable than his regular posture, which he'd tried to keep in this foreign form. Taking an experimental few steps forward, this animalistic stride was indeed much easier than his human one. With a deep breath and a low crouch before, Gaara set off in his first successful run in this bestial form. It was certainly exhilarating. If nothing else, Gaara was bounding along much faster than he could hope to run in his human form, though he wasn't about to be thankful for this dislikable turn of events. When he'd finished his, admittedly fast, run, Gaara stopped off near a small lake in the middle of the woods. He wasn't going to drink from it. His pride had suffered enough blows for one night, but the water's still and reflective surface would serve another useful purpose. Peering into the mirror-like lake, Gaara was finally able to see just how bad his transformation had been. It was bad. He still had his red hair on the top of his head and his green eyes, which was a comfort of sorts as he had briefly feared that he would have Shukaku's distinctive demonic irises. Under his fringe lay his tattoo, his reminder. The only other facial feature that he recognized as himself were the permanent dark circles around his eyes, though they had become much more pronounced than they had been before, which was saying something. The tattoo, now that he looked closely, inching towards the water's edge, looked blurred and faded, which was to be expected, as was the darkening of the black circles around his eyes. When he saw that, unlike before when they were simple skin pigmentations or modifications, they were now colorations of his fur. Gaara's eyes were then drawn to where his human ears had disappeared from, only for them to be replaced by large tanuki ones, much like Shukaku's own, including the blue tips. He was annoyed to find that they, like his tail, twitched and reacted to his mood as shown by their current downward pointing position, displaying his predictably negative feelings. What was worse was that they were much larger than Shukaku's miniature ears, drooping down almost to Gaara's slumped shoulders. His entire body was covered in the soft, fine, sandy-colored fur, including his face, which now looked more animal than human, even having a muzzle rather than just a regular nose, and on the end of said muzzle sat a small pink rhinarium. The blue markings present on all of his body, so much like those found on Shukaku's body, also seemed to be arranged so that they centered in on Gaara's belly, which he was glad to see didn't have the same exaggerated rotund appearance that his unwelcome tenant had. Instead, the markings swirled around the seal on his stomach. The seal, like his tattoo and the signs of his insomnia and possession, was in the coloration of his fur now and so didn't disappear when he stopped channeling chakra, not that he could use any chakra in this form. The only thing left to examine was his gigantic tail, which he had had to look behind himself to see before, and only now could he truly appreciate its enormous size and girth next to his laughably tiny body. Now satisfied that he knew at least what he was dealing with, Gaara moved away from his temporary mirror in order to perfect the running he should have mastered in his infancy and also to see the extent of his tail's formidable power when he used it as an almighty club. The running didn't take as long to learn as he had feared, being largely instinctual when he ran on all four paws, but the tail swinging was more difficult it seemed, as more than once he found himself losing his footing when the weight of it was moved too quickly or too far away from his center of gravity. What he was happy to see was that the tail was actually able to leave a sizable dent in the bark of a tree he hit it with. Gaara had little doubt that if he had to, he could easily wind somebody with this useful appendage, which was a welcome thought despite his previous abilities overshadowing this by no small measure. Through this fascinating learning experience, Gaara had regrettably neglected to keep his sensitive fuzzy ears, now perked up in excitement, concentrated on his surroundings and so missed the ominous wheezing sound nearing him at an alarming speed. Only when the temperature plummeted and his fur bristled in warning did Gaara finally notice the Dementor that was now floating down from the canopy, focused on Gaara. The small fluffy creature weighed up his severely limited options in an instant: fight or flight. Considering his fighting capabilities were currently limited to his sharp yet tiny claws and his humongous tail, both of which were completely useless against a Dementor, which he had seen in the past recover from even the most brutal blunt force traumas, only dying when it was pierced through the head, which was an impossible task for his woefully short claws, he was leaning towards flight. As his options, however limited, flew through his mind, Gaara watched the nightmarish monster descend upon him. The ghoulish entity swooped down on the shivering Gaara, though he would deny that assessment to the bitter end, with all of the grace one would expect from the Grim Reaper reconnecting with an old acquaintance. By the time he had clearly assessed the situation, once he was able to fight back the fear that was so foreign to him, having had a solid stone wall of protection surrounding him all of his life, Gaara realized that he had no options left to him. He could not fight for lack of strength and weapons, and he could not run because the abomination in front of him was clearly much faster and stronger than him at the moment. Gaara could only remember one other time in his life when he had been completely defenseless and helpless, when he had lost to the boy who was just like him, on the day of the Chunin exam finals. Although the fight had technically been a draw, neither party officially losing, Gaara knew he had lost then, and now he had lost again, and for the same reason, because he had no one to rely upon. But this time he didn't have his brother and sister to drop down and protect him in his moment of vulnerability. He was once again alone in the world because he had failed to trust someone, anyone, yet again. Not one to go out without some measure of a fight, Gaara got up onto his back legs and prepared himself for his very own miniature battle of Thermopylae, ready to fight until the bitter end. The Dementor took one final passing sweep towards the snarling mini-Baiju before it abruptly turned and began to move back towards the treetops, seemingly disinterested with the angry little animal. Whilst Gaara watched what he had been sure was finally going to kill him fly back into the blackened sky, he fell backwards onto his tail, which made for a comfortable beanbag-style seat, in a sudden moment overwhelmed shock. He couldn't believe he'd survived another near-death experience. By the way the Dementors had been drawn to him in the past, he'd assumed they were attracted to the power he held within him, but apparently he'd been mistaken. Either he was mistaken or Dementors couldn't sense the souls of animals, but that was obviously not right. Who would employ prison guards that didn't account for any animals? Gaara spent the rest of the night roaming around the woods, avoiding any and all noises he heard for fear of smarter Dementors that might finish the job of the last one that had almost scared him to death. By the end of the night, Gaara was happy to note that he had mastered running again. Then again, he wasn't going to go and shout about his mastery of running on all fours, but he was still secretly pleased, even allowing a small smirk to appear on his candid face, briefly revealing the rows of tiny razor-sharp teeth, before they disappeared again. As the black of night began to turn into dark blue, Gaara started on his way back to wherever he had left his clothes at the beginning of his latest adventure. Once again, his thoughts were dragged back to whether or not he would indeed turn back into a human in an hour or so when the sun peeked over the horizon. Otherwise he was going to have a much more problematic time ahead of him, like the explanations he would have to make, and trying to turn back through his own power or with help from another. Before he could worry any more about his form, Gaara had a more imminent problem that he had underestimated earlier on, and that was how difficult it was to trace his steps back to where he'd left his clothes, especially when he had fled in a panic from his professor. On that note, he would have to be careful around Professor Hagrid for the next few days so that he wasn't recognized inadvertently for the similarities between his true form and this one. It took a lot longer than Gaara had expected to find his discarded garments, which were very cold and dewy after a long night in the burrow of a tree. Nevertheless, he waited on bated breath for the sun to finally show its face and let him turn back into a human. As the blinding white light of the nearest star rose into sight, Gaara felt the more than welcome and so very familiar feeling of changing, like he had at the beginning of the night, and he did not fight the sensation as it spread over his small body. Unlike before, though, the human weapon didn't pass out during the transformation, so he got to experience the strange and uncomfortable sensation of his body physically morphing into a different form. As the fur crept back into his skin and his tail receded in his spine, Gaara felt his bones creak as they too became a human again, reverting to their regular size and shape. The experience was not painless, it was not quick, and it was not fun, but once it was over and done with, Gaara was better off for it as far as he was concerned. Sluggishly, the newly formed body picked itself off of the ground, letting go a sigh of relief at seeing his body once again in the correct shape, and stumbled over to his waiting clothes as quickly as he could. He put on his damp clothes eagerly, having had quite enough of the freezing morning air in direct contact with his skin. Fighting off a shiver as he dressed himself, he did a once-over to check there were no lasting effects of his transformation, to which he thankfully found none, other than his sore throat. An experimental attempted hum proved that his voice was still lost to him, disappointingly. Now dressed and ready to make the long, and apparently unnecessary, walk back to the castle, Gaara called the sand out of his pocket with the ease gained from years of repetition and cast his long-awaited third eye technique. He sent the orb into the air, so high that, when activated, he could see tens of miles all around him. He really was a very long way away from Hogwarts. He immediately started off running and hopping. If he was lucky, he would make it back to the castle in time for lunch, as he was feeling incredibly fatigued from all of the exertions in the last 12 hours and could do with a good meal. Luckily, it seemed he had not forgotten how to run as a human after a night on all fours. When the trees became a little denser, Gaara leapt up to one of the branches before jumping onwards from tree to tree, making much better time than he had on his way into the woods. As he flew through the air, periodically bouncing off of another thick tree branch, Gaara wondered why there seemed to be so few animals in the forest. Even normal forests back in his world had more wildlife than this one, and this was supposed to be the Forbidden Forest, named so because of all of the dangerous and dark creatures there. But so far that night he'd only encountered a herd of overly friendly winged horses and the gigantic groundskeeper, neither of which seemed all that scary to the boy who had fought a toad the size of Hogwarts and lived. Where all of the deadly animals he'd been told about were he didn't know, but it seemed a little misleading nonetheless. His question was answered all too soon when the trees became too far in between to jump across efficiently, and he was forced to move along the earth again. As he continued to run, wondering idly how he was going to explain his absence upon his return, Gaara felt a familiar rumbling. It wasn't his stomach. Well, it mostly wasn't his stomach. The almost quaking ground reminded him of the last time he'd had to trek back through the forest after his fall off his feathered transportation, but that time he had needed medical attention too urgently to check it out. This time the rumbling was coming from the general direction of the castle, meaning it was in his path anyway and he could fight off most regular animals with just the small amount of sand he was carrying. So he wasn't worried in any case, and taking a detour to avoid it wouldn't be nearly as interesting. Gaara began to slow down as the rumbling intensified. He noticed that the deafening noise was oscillating slowly and steadily. Gaara wasn't usually one to succumb to curiosity like this, being too sensible for such treacherous actions, but living in a world where he was treated like a child had apparently worn down his resistance to his immature impulses. As he walked into an area clearly inhabited by a large animal, if the compacted soil and snapped twigs were any indication, Gaara began to work out what the rumbling he was approaching was. He had definitely heard it before in his own world, albeit much quieter, but couldn't quite place it. When the rumbling was interrupted by a loud and vulgar snort, Gaara remembered the first time he had heard the annoying noise. Annoying, because he had first heard it when he was 8 years old, living in Kankuro and Timari's apartment, and he had managed to wrestle Shikaku into getting an hour of real sleep without demonic possession, one rare night. He had been asleep for less than half an hour when he was awoken by the very same rumbling, coming from his brother's room. Needless to say that Gaara had not been happy, being woken up by Kankuro's loud snores. The teenage puppet user had had a narrow escape that night as Gaara tried in earnest to kill his kin for snoring too loudly. That night taught Kankuro never to sleep on his back ever again. Now that Gaara knew he was approaching a snoring giant, he became a touch more wary, knowing that anything large enough to snore that deafeningly loud would have to be a veritable behemoth. Still, he'd come this far. He'd been hungrier before and he'd already missed the first few hours of school, so he really wasn't in any hurry to get there, and he could defend himself adequately. Compared to his previous state, Gaara was feeling positively invincible. He continued forward into the creature's den, but had to do a double take, an action he disliked performing, after he saw what he had assumed was an abandoned hot tub. As he looked again, paying closer scrutiny to the object, he saw that it was in fact a giant food bowl. It didn't take a prodigious shinobi to realize that whatever he was walking towards was truly enormous. He heard shuffling just a little further on, so he didn't get an opportunity to read the creature's name off of the side of the dish as he pressed onwards. Then he saw it. He had heard of this creature before, or something like it, in his world, as a myth of course, or should he say these creatures. He stared across at the three faces connected to three necks connected to one body and thought it might be the single largest dog he'd ever seen. The enormous brown, three-headed, Staffordshire Bull Terrier was clearly asleep. Curiously, only two of the heads were snoring. The one in the middle was sleeping silently with a snot bubble the size of Gaara's head inflating and deflating in time with the dog's heavy breathing. Deciding his curiosity had been sated sufficiently, Gaara concluded he should let sleeping three-headed dogs lie and make a hasty retreat before he woke the beast's up. Fighting a dog that large with that many mouths could be hazardous to his health. He didn't make it more than 5 steps back before he heard the heavy rhythmic breathing hitch and a deep grumbling sound replace it. Turning around, Gaara saw what he had hoped he would not, his just desserts for listening to his demons. The figurative ones. The real one was now calling for him to use its chakra to save the both of them. Oh, how nice it was to hear the old voices in his head again. The Cerberus had definitely woken up and didn't look too happy about the tiny wake-up call that was still slowly retreating. Gaara's mind quickly began to work on how he could defeat the hellish dog with the minute amount of sand he had on his person. Deciding he had no choice but to kill the beast, he hardened the sand into a foot-long, razor-sharp spike and readied it to be fired off into the dog's waiting heart. The animal turned all 3 of its heads into the air and took a sniff before turning back to Gaara with a determined look set upon all of its faces. The appetizer of a boy watched it slowly stalk towards him but didn't fire off his sand, knowing he only had 1 shot in which to kill the canine and could ill afford to miss. As the 3 giant heads bore down on Gaara's still form, they gave 1 more sniff before opening their mouths filled with enormous, pointy teeth and the stench of decaying meat. Gaara, for his part, was staying absolutely still on the off chance that the dog would tire of him and he wouldn't need to kill it. The mouths, each big enough for him to climb inside of comfortably, positioned themselves all around him, showing that they were indeed going to attack. The encircling mouths moved in closer to the boy, as said boy raised his hand in preparation to fire the sand senbon through the central head's throat and into where its heart should be. And then it all came to a head when Gaara felt his left side heat up suddenly, feeling almost on fire with the burning warmth before his right followed suit. His vision went black and he still didn't fire his weapon. When the warmth left him, Gaara disgustedly felt how wet the 3 gigantic tongues had left him after their joyful licking of his entire body. Lowering his arm slowly, reluctantly, Gaara saw and smelt the panting and excited dog before him, wearing no malevolent expressions, just doggish joy. He considered still attacking the dog for the grievous insult to his already bruised ego, as the enormous patches of dog saliva dripped to the ground, but couldn't bring himself to do it when the dogs sat back on their haunches and looked at him expectantly with absolutely no malice on their faces. Gaara had no idea why the animals of this world were so enamored with him, but he wasn't sure whether it was a blessing or a curse as he continued on his way, ignoring the dog's pained whines at being left alone again. Gaara wasn't an animal person anyway, having been scorned by 1 too many animals in his own world who would try to attack him after sensing the malicious chakra he held. Then there was the incident in his youth when he had been lusting after blood and came across the zoo. Still, Gaara had no real hatred for animals, so his grudge against the sad-looking and friendly-acting dog couldn't withstand the soft nudging his back received every few steps from the right head's nose. Turning around, Gaara lessened his glare at the oversized puppy and patted each dog's nose in a friendly gesture with the hope that the dog would then leave him alone after being shown some kindness. Apparently not. Even as he continued on his way, the uproarious sounds of the dog attempting to follow him inconspicuously was noticeable to say the least, so Gaara turned around again, with a measured reluctance, to address the issue. He couldn't very well bring the giant mutt back to the castle, even if it was a pet of one of the professors, so he tried to think of a quick and humane solution to his problem so he could leave and wash off the copious amounts of saliva he was plastered in as quickly as possible. He soon came up with an idea that might just work. Standing at his full height, which wasn't all that impressive to begin with, and turning on his death glare, he looked in the central dog's eyes and pointed at the floor in the harshest and most menacing manner he could. The dogs' heads, with their ears down flat, immediately bowed. All three heads and sat back down as per Gaara's silent command. The mutine was happy with this result as it meant that dog was trained to some degree at least and would respond to non-verbal commands. Gaara, in yet another and seemingly increasingly frequent spur of childish enthrallment and curiosity, tried a few more simple command gestures like lie down and roll over before he realized he'd wasted much more time than he should have allowed himself to, playing with a possibly stray dog. Telling the dog to stay, Gaara patted each of the Cerberus heads, having to jump a little each time, before leaving quickly and ever quietly. He could hear the dogs whine pathetically for the next mile of his trek, before it was cut off by a few resounding barks and a heavy thudding that faded fast as they both moved further away from one another. As he continued running, deciding against washing off for the moment when he saw the edges of one of the ponds he passed over frosted lightly, telling him just how cold the water was likely to be, Gaara smiled at the thought that popped into his head suddenly, of training the overgrown puppy to fight for him like a summon animal. He could just imagine it running towards his enemy and then running back just as fast with its tail between its legs. By the time Gaara reached the edge of the forbidden forest, the dog's saliva that had covered him, literally from head to toe, was almost dry, thanks to the shining sun and the freezing autumn wind that he had been running against for the past half hour. Gaara had been happily surprised when he hadn't been engaged by any dementors on his return journey. The mute redhead was beginning to seriously doubt the Wizarding World's security if their prison guards couldn't sense animals and didn't come out when the sun was shining. But he was probably just overthinking things. Another worrying point was that he was effectively sneaking back into Hogwarts in the middle of the day, and so far no one had seen him or questioned his motives, or even noticed his re-entry. If he was a rogue, escaped mass murderer, like some people he could mention, Gaara could have already snuck into the school and killed Harry Potter and half a dozen other people and escaped again, all within 10 minutes. He was almost tempted to prove his point, but that wasn't what he did anymore, even if the boy was annoying. Though, while it had seemed so very easy to slip into Hogwarts, past all of the supposed wards and protections, getting past the hordes of students and the occasional teacher was not so simple. Gaara had never specialized in stealth, that was Kankuro's forte. He was a frontline fighter, so he was not in his element as he evaded detection. Sure, he could fight his way in, but that wasn't really the subtle entrance he was working towards. It took him nearly 30 minutes to actually enter the castle, having had to find an entrance that wasn't filled with students chatting endlessly and apparently without regard for their classes. The reason the heavy artillery was attempting to sneak into the castle, other than the probable fear his sudden appearance might induce in any nearby students, was because he hadn't exactly signed out the night before, and his entering back into the castle would strongly imply that he had, at some point, left the castle without permission. This discovery could lead to all sorts of related rule breaking he had undertaken the night before, not least his assault on Draco Malfoy and his killing several Dementors on his way into the Forbidden Forest, to name a few. Then there was the slight chance that someone might connect his stalking off into the forest with Hagrid's accounts of a strange new animal. All in all, it was certainly wisest to take the path of secrecy on this one and just not say a word about what he had been up to the night before, not that he could say anything anyway, though this would just make his silence on the matter all the easier. It took even longer to get back into the dungeons. having to go so far as to knock out 3 or 4 more students, all Slytherins, on his way to enter the common room. Gaara figured, since he was already on the line for knocking out his roommate, there really wasn't much harm in sending a few housemates, who had decided to spend their lunch break in their common room, to an early night's rest at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. From the common room, Gaara then had to throw a smoke bomb into the corridor leading to the dorms. Luckily, everyone present was convinced that this prank was perpetrated by the notorious Weasley twins. The twins later denied this accusation fiercely, upset by the audacity of a fellow prankster hitting Slytherin before they had a chance to. That year, Fred and George decided then that they would have to do something big to regain their imaginary titles of Lord Pranksters after being shown up not once but twice. Meanwhile, Gaara had slipped into his shared room and deposited the tiny amount of sand he had carried with him into his dearly missed gourd. Every time he left his sand he always regretted it. Knowing he had at least a few hours before Draco returned from classes or dinner, Gaara changed into his bedclothes after wiping the last of the dog spit from his person and readied himself to confront the beast within. It didn't help that the act of getting into his pajamas made the stoic ninja remember the time a certain someone had decided no Jinchuriki should be without a goofy nightcap made to look like something eating your head. Despite his clear and reasonable objections to wearing the abomination, Gaara had worn it that one time to stop his most generous friend sulking and pouting all mission long. Those joint Konosuba missions were trying times. Soon, Gaara was able to clear his head of distractions, and then he was ready. Sitting down on his bed, he called his sand to attention so that it would be ready to protect him instantly should any threat appear while he was out. Closing his tired, blackened eyes, Gaara concentrated like he had done in the forest. This time, however, he successfully found himself in the desert of his mind, complete with a sandstorm on the horizon and the nearby red-rocked cave, his destination. Gaara walked into the sheltering cave and continued downwards until he came upon his hidden burden. It seemed he wasn't the only one to suffer the night before. Enormous pillars of sand, acting as a barrier to his conscious mind, used to stand like bars to a great cage across the cave, but now those bars were gone and Shukaku was stood flat against the wall. Well, the beast didn't have much of a choice in his position as his giant hands appeared to have been impaled by equally large nails of sand to the bedrock behind them. As soon as the captive caught sight of his warden, having previously been too distracted by the pain to notice him coming, he began to howl and scream with such fury that had not been seen since his days as the boy's stand-in mother, demanding blood sacrifices and the like. Gaara didn't hold any sympathy for the monster before him, remembering the pain it had caused him and the fact that it would heal as soon as the nails were removed. Still, he did wince every time the tanuki pulled at the bonds only to yelp and roar with pain. The worst part was that despite the obvious agony caused, Shukaku kept on pulling against them, eliciting more shrieks of tortured anguish. Gaara didn't know if his demon was just tenacious, or doing it to make him cringe. Ignoring his discomfort at hearing such familiar sounds, Gaara waited for Shukaku to finish his wailing so that he could find out what exactly had happened inside of his mind and soul. He had never heard of a seal spontaneously changing like this. But then he had also never heard of a shinobi traveling across worlds like he had. Eventually, after what honestly seemed like hours, the Yakibi finished and slumped down against his restraints, breathing in long heavy breaths. "What happened?" Gaara asked in his usual direct manner after the longest time, his patience having lost out to his impatience. "What do you mean what happened?" Shukaku roared at its host, pulling against its restraints again to try and attack, over and over. "My hands have been nailed to a wall, you stupid little weapon." "You don't know what happened, then?" Gaara asked. "Well," Shukaku had a most disturbing smirk set into his maw as he considered his words, "I don't know why that happened last night, but I most certainly did see it. I watched the whole night out of your eyes." Gaara stilled, realizing the demon now had material for annoying him for years to come. He prepared himself for what was to come. You were absolutely adorable. Such a cute baby tanuki. Remember, you need to eat all of your humans if you want to grow up big and strong like Yamama. Gaara winced as the roars of laughter exceeded the earlier pain's screams in intensity. I can't wait for next month. You make almost as bad a tanuki as you do a human. Be quiet. Admit it, you're going soft. You're getting weak. Soon enough, one of these real humans is going to come and kill you. They'll end your existence and you'll have never existed. Hell, that cloaked thing last night almost finished you off. The weakness last night was because of the form. On my way out, I killed several dementors with ease. The only weakness I have is that I am still alone. You'll stay alone. Kill them all. Just like your mother told you to, like she wanted. Gaara looked up at the beast of scorn, considering him for a few moments before ever calmly saying, I'm leaving. As he walked out of the cave, he heard more jeers and the mockery but paid them no heed whatsoever. He'd had his fill of dealing with Shukaku for the day, and his tiresome conversation had revealed little to him other than the fact that his beast could view events directly when he was transformed on the full moon, an altogether useless discovery. When he was stood in the surface planes of his mind, Gaara closed his eye and waited to wake up.